Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. We're in part 2, and this part will give us a good look at how each of the characters argues about their understanding of who God is. So we begin with Demea, who addresses Cleanthes and says that nothing could surprise me more than the light in which you have all put this argument. By the whole trend and tone of your remarks, one would think you were maintaining the existence of God against the objections of atheists and infidels. And yet you felt a need to stand up for that fundamental principle of all religion. But I hope there's no question here about the existence of God. I'm sure that no man, or anyway, no man of common sense, ever had a serious doubt regarding such a certain and self-evident truth. So Demea's view is that everybody believes in God. It's common sense. So there might be a few people who lack common sense, and they don't, therefore, believe in God. But for everyone else, this is common sense. The problem, therefore, would be in correctly living. Problem of the will, knowing what to do, but not a problem of knowing God. So the question is not about the existence of God, but about the nature of God. And because the infirmities of human understanding, I contend, the nature of God is entirely incomprehensible and unknown to us. Now, Demea is putting that in a way that sounds pious. We're weak, reason's weak, and God is so great that God is incomprehensible to us. The essence of that supreme mind, his attributes, his ways of existing, his way of lasting through time, all these are mysterious to us. We are finite, weak, and blind creatures. Now, the problem, when he says all of these are hidden from human curiosity by a deep cloud, and it's insulting to God to try to penetrate those sacred obscurities. The audacity of prying into God's nature and essence, his decrees and attributes, is second only to the impiety of denying his existence. So it's interesting. On the one hand, it's impious to deny God exists, but it's also impious or presumptuous, audacious, to claim to be able to know God. Instead, what you have to do is accept God exists and God is a mystery beyond all human comprehension. So lest you should think that my piety has here overpowered my philosophy, I shall support my opinion, if it needs any support, by a very great authority. And so he's going to quote from Father Malebranche, who says, one ought to call God a spirit, not so much to express positively that he is as to signify that he is not matter. He is an infinitely perfect being. This we cannot doubt. But just as we oughtn't to imagine, even supposing him corporeal, that he has a human body, so we oughtn't to imagine that the Spirit of God has human ideas or bears any resemblance to our spirit on the grounds that we know nothing more perfect than a human mind. So God is beyond our comprehension. This is taken by Demea, who's sort of the standard believer, to be a pious thing to say. You're somehow protecting God, and it's putting humans down, that we're just limited, finite things that can't really comprehend. And God is so far beyond us, we shouldn't even try. Now, Philo steps in. After so great an authority as that, Demea, replied Philo, and 1,000 more that you could produce, it would appear ridiculous in me to add my own view or express my approval of your doctrine. But surely when reasonable men discuss these subjects, their topic is never the existence of God, but only his nature. So again, Philo and Demea will oftentimes seem to be similar. Cleanthes is going to point that out and warn Demea. Say, Demea, you think he's on your side, but he's not. And that comes out later in the work. But Philo is the skeptic mystic. So he's all too happy to say, yeah, people can't understand God. They can't comprehend God. They only know that he exists. That's self-evident. Nothing exists without a cause, and the original cause of the universe we call God. But beyond that, we can't know anything else. Whoever questions this fundamental truth deserves every punishment the philosophers can inflict on one another. The fundamental truth being everything has a cause, and there's an original cause. God is perfect. But we shouldn't think that our ideas of wisdom, thought, etc., in any way correspond to those perfections in God. In reality, Cleanthes, Philo is continuing, we can arrive at this position without help from the pretend skepticism that you dislike. Here's how. Our ideas reach no further than our experience. We have no experience of divine attributes and operations. So Philo is starting out as an empiricist. We can only know what we can experience, and we've never experienced the divine. Even if we had an experience that we said was of God, you're not experiencing infinity. You're just experiencing something in your limited field. So Philo is going to continue on that thread throughout this. And if we're to identify presuppositions to understand how a thinker is shaped, that is the one we need to remember for Philo. All experience is from the senses. How do we know if that's true or not? Let's see what Cleanthes says. I shan't beat about the bush, said Cleanthes, addressing himself to Demea. Still less shall I reply to Philo's pious speeches. What I shall do is to explain briefly how I conceive the matter. Look around the world, contemplate the whole thing and every part of it, and you'll find that it is nothing but one big machine, subdivided into an infinite number of smaller ones, which in their turn could be subdivided to a degree beyond what human senses and faculties can trace and explain. All these various machines, and even their most minute parts, are adjusted to each other so precisely that everyone who has ever contemplated them is filled with wonder. The intricate fitting of means to ends throughout all nature is just like the fitting of means and ends of things that have been produced by us. So he's arguing here from our experience of machines. By analogy, the world, the universe is like that. Today, it's interesting how much David Hume anticipates. Today, these are called fine-tuning arguments. The universe is finely tuned, like a machine. And since humans understand that if you see a finely tuned car, you don't say, wow, look what blind chance and evolution produced. You say, look what a human made. And in the same way, we wouldn't look at the universe, which is finely tuned, and say, wow, look what blind chance and evolution did. You'd say, there must be a creator. So that's going to be Cleanthes' argument throughout this. It's called in philosophy an a posteriori argument. From experience. Above here, Philo said, you can argue from cause to effect. This is a kind of a priori argument because you're arguing from the fact of causation to the reality of a first cause. You could shift that into a posteriori if you're arguing from your experience of cause in the world. But Philo is okay with this one, and you have this kind of mystical, distant cause. But he's not going to be okay with Cleanthes' design argument. So let's keep going here. Demea steps in and says, from the beginning, I could not approve of your conclusion about the similarity of God to man. So remember, Cleanthes is saying, God is like us in being a designer. And still less can I approve of your ways of trying to establish it. What? No demonstration that God exists, no abstract arguments, no a priori proofs. And here the editor puts in an a priori argument is one that proceeds by sheer thinking, making no use of contingent facts about what the world is like. An argument that does appeal to facts is called a posteriori, which is what Cleanthes says his argument is. What about the arguments that have in the past been so much insisted upon by philosophers? Are they all fallacious, all mere tricks? Do experience and probability mark the limit to how far we can go in this subject? So Demia's whole case is that our experience isn't of God. So we can't argue from our experience to God. So you can see how they have very different presuppositions about the nature of our knowledge and the nature of God. My main reservation about what Cleanthes said, Philo remarks, is not so much that he bases all religious arguments on experience, as that his arguments seem not to be the most certain and unbreakable, even of that inferior kind. So for Demia, the problem with Cleanthes is that he's arguing from our experiences to what is incomprehensible. For Philo, the problem is the arguments Cleanthes gives aren't even very good arguments of that sort of argument. And why does he think that? Well, they require a similarity between what we're familiar with and what we're arguing to. But perhaps the universe, we're only aware of a very small part of the universe. Perhaps if we were to become more aware of it, we would see it's nothing at all like the machines we know about. So this argument is very frail. The exact similarity of the cases gives us a perfect assurance of a similar outcome. But the evidence is less strong when the cases are less than perfectly alike. So if the universe turns out not to really look like a machine at all, then this argument fails. So if we see a house, Cleanthes, and we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had an architect or builder, because this is precisely the kind of effect that we've experienced as coming from that kind of cause. But surely you want to say the universe is like a house that we can, with the same certainty, infer a similar cause, or that the analogy is here entire and perfect. The unlikeness in this case is so striking that the most you can offer on the basis of it is a guess, a conjecture, a presumption about something similar. So the universe isn't like a machine or a house after all. So Cleanthes says, if I granted that the proofs of the existence of a God amount to no more than a guess or conjecture, that wouldn't be well received, and I would be deservedly blamed and detested. Now, when he says that, he gets at one of the problems behind, especially for Demia as a believer. If you can only guess at or conjecture about God's existence, this isn't sufficient to base your life on. And yet our beliefs about God do shape our lives. So in that sense, we're saying that we have more than just guesses. So his argument, he says, is based on the fittingness of means and ends. Not that the universe is a big house made out of wood and styrofoam and tiles, but that the universe, like a machine, has means and ends, and that requires an intelligent creator. The order, proportion, and arrangement of every part is like a house. So he says it's not certain, but it's also not mere presumption or conjecture. And Demia now interrupts. Good God, exclaimed Demia, interrupted him. What do we come to? Earnest defenders of religion admitting that the proofs of a God fall short of being perfectly evident? Are you, Philo, whose help I depend on improving the worshipful mystery and mysterioususness of God's nature, do you assent to all these extreme opinions of Cleanthes? For how else can I describe them? So Philo says, you seem not to grasp that I argue with Cleanthes in his own way. I hope by showing him the dangerous consequences of his views, I shall finally bring him to share our opinion. But what bothers you most, I notice, is Cleanthes' account of the argument a posteriori. You find that the argument, in his version of it, is likely to slip out of your grasp and vanish into thin air. So Philo wants more than what the a posteriori argument can provide. This seems to only give us conjecture, whereas an a priori argument, say from causation, gives us certainty. If a man were to set aside everything he knows or has seen, he would be entirely unable to work out, merely from his own ideas, what the universe must be like, or to think one state of affairs to be more likely than another. Nothing that he clearly conceives could be thought to be impossible or to imply a contradiction. So it's interesting. If you can conceive of it, it's not a contradiction. That's one of the important pieces of Hume's epistemology. Now, can you conceive of a square circle? Can you conceive of an uncaused event? He says you can't. You just conceive of something happening with nothing before it. So that's not a contradiction. Now, the next step in the argument, after he has opened his eyes and sees the world as it really is, he can't at first tell what the cause was of any one event, much less the totality of the things in the universe. So if you start with no information and you open your eyes and you see the world around you, you wouldn't know which things are causes and which things are effects. These would all be possible because they would all be equally possible. He could never, from his own resources, explain why he prefers one to the other. So from experience, we can't even know causation. Now, to me, this method of reasoning leads to something that Cleanthes himself has tacitly admitted, namely, order, arrangement, or the suitability of things for various purposes is not of itself any proof that a designer has been at work, except in cases where experience has shown us that such order, arrangement, etc., is due to a designer. For we all know, a priori, matter may have a source of order within it, just as mind have it inherently. So the fact that when we open our eyes and we see what looks like order doesn't tell us there's an external creator who did the ordering. It might be the case that matter has a principle in it so that when you start it up and let it go, it orders itself. So again, he's saying that from experience, we don't get to the idea of a creator or organizer. Perhaps it's the case that the elements are caused to come together in this arrangement by some unknown cause. So he says, I admit, shocked by the assertion of a resemblance between God and human creatures. I can't help seeing it as implying such a lowering of the supreme being that no right-thinking theist could put up with it. With your assistance, therefore, Demia, I shall try to defend what you justly call the worshipful mysteriousness of God's nature. When Cleanthes had agreed to this, Philo, after a short pause, proceeded in the following manner. In the meantime, I shan't agree much with your thesis that all inferences concerning matters of fact are based on experience, that all experimental reasoning is based on the supposition that familiar causes produce familiar effects. But please notice how extremely cautious good thinkers are in transferring a discovered result to a similar cause. So this really becomes a debate about epistemology. The subject is God and the nature of God. But because they disagree about about metaphysics, what's the nature of God, they're being pressed back to consider their assumptions about knowledge. And Philo is going to attack the empiricism of Cleanthes. Remember, Philo is a skeptic, right? So earlier he might say, no knowledge except for by experience, but he was arguing that way to take clean up these assumptions and say, even with your assumptions, you don't end up with God. But here he's now going to raise problems about the idea that there is cause and effect, arguing from what seems to be a similar case, when in fact we don't know if it's a similar case. If you have a change in size, position, arrangement, age, disposition of the air or surrounding bodies, any of these could bring with it the most unexpected consequences. Unless the objects are quite familiar to us, it is much too bold to expect confidently that when a cause has been found to have a certain effect, another cause, differing from the earlier one in one of these ways, will have the same effect. So unless they're actually identical, you don't know what the effect will be. If you change even a small part of the cause, you sometimes get wildly different effects that come out of it that you couldn't have anticipated. So the slow and deliberate steps of scientists, here if anywhere, are in contrast with the precipitate march of common men who, hurried along by the smallest similarity, are incapable of pondering or making distinctions. Which group, Cleanthes, have you shown yourself to belong to? The common person rushes ahead and assumes these things are similar enough, so they'll produce a similar outcome, but they don't. The scientist slows down and says, well, let's think about the causes here. How do they differ? And how might that change things? You're usually cool and philosophical in these matters, but has your usual attitude been preserved in the stride you are taking and likening the universe, the houses, ships, furniture, and machines? Thought, design, intelligence, such as we discover them in men and other animals, is just one of the springs and forces of the universe, along with heat and cold, attraction and repulsion, and 100 others that we observe daily. It is an active cause through which we find certain particular parts of nature produce alterations in other parts. And can it be proper to argue from the parts to the whole? So just because one part, a human, is needed to design another part, an automobile, those are parts of the universe. Doesn't it follow from that the whole universe is like an automobile that needs a designer? That's a fallacy. Anyway, even if we do take the operations of one part of nature on another as our basis for a judgment about the origin of the whole, why would we select as our basis such a tiny, weak, limited cause as the reason and design of animals on this planet seems to be? This little agitation of the brain that we call thought, what special privilege does it have that entitles it to serve as a model for the whole universe? It looms large for us because we are always in the presence of it. A sound philosophy ought carefully to guard against this kind of natural illusion. So again, a humbling of human reason, he calls it a mere agitation of the brain. Your brain gets a little vibrations in it, a thought pops out, and you think that's the model for the whole universe? Doesn't that sound presumptuous? So far from admitting, continued Philo, that the operations of a part entitle us to draw any conclusion about the origin of the whole, I won't even allow any one part to justify conclusions about another part. Right? You can't argue, since the car needs a designer, the tree needs a designer, let alone since the car needs a designer, the whole thing needs a designer. Is there any reasonable ground to conclude that the inhabitants of other planets have thought, intelligence, reason, or anything similar to these faculties that men have? So it's interesting here, 1776, he's discussing inhabitants of other planets. Sometimes we think that only started after Roswell. That's been a common speculation about humans. That's really what the polytheistic deities were, right? The planets are named after them, and they reside up there somewhere. So the inhabitants of other planets, when nature is operated in such a wide variety of ways on this small planet, can we think that she incessantly copies herself to the rest of the immense universe? And habits of other planets might be entirely different, not similar at all. But even if we are perfectly sure that thought and reason, similar to ours, is to be found throughout the whole universe, and even if its activity elsewhere in the universe is vastly greater in scope, more powerful than it appears to be on this planet, still I cannot see that the operations of a world that is fully constituted, arranged, and adjusted can properly be extended to a world that is in its embryo state and still moving towards the finished constitution and arrangement. So he's going to introduce a number of dissimilarities. The first was about reason and its ability or inability. Now he's going to say, well, there might be big differences between a young world and a mature, organized world that we don't understand how those differences affect things. By observation, we know a certain amount about how a finished animal moves, but we should be cautious about transferring that knowledge speculatively to the growth of a fetus in the womb. Right? The grown dog bears little similarity to a fetus of a dog. So you can't argue between them and say, well, since a grown dog has this, therefore a fetus does too. Which stage is the universe at? A very small part of this great system of the universe, during a very short period of time, is very imperfectly revealed to us. Do we then pronounce confidently about the origin of the whole? We only have a small awareness of what the universe is like, and it's very imperfect. How do we argue from that to a designer? All we can say is at this time, on this little planet, stone, wood, brick, iron, brass are not ordered or arranged except through human artifice and contrivance. Therefore, the universe couldn't originally attain its order and arrangement without something similar to human artifice. That's a very weak argument from experience. How do we know what's required in starting a universe just because we know what is required to start a house? Imagine a little kid who's been stacking those ABC blocks in kindergarten, telling architect of a major skyscraper, oh yeah, I basically know how to do that. I've been stacking blocks also. It was not similar at all. So can you blame me, Cleanthes, if I here imitate the wise caution of Simonides? According to the famous story, Hiero asked him, what is God? And Simonides asked for a day to think about it, and then 2 days more. And in that way, he continually prolonged his time for thinking about it, without ever producing a definition or a description. Could you ever blame me if I answered straight off that I didn't know what God is and was aware that this subject lies vastly beyond the reach of my faculties? You might cry skeptic and tease as much as you please, but having found the imperfections and even contradictions of human reason when it is exercised on so many other subjects that are much more familiar than this one, I would never expect any success from reason's feeble conjectures concerning a subject that is so elevated and so remote from the sphere of our observation. So he starts out beginning with that. Okay, we don't know and we can't know. Skeptic. The mystical part will get added in later at the end when he says, we still have to believe something, though. But we really don't know. We don't have any arguments. To make this reasoning, what humans can figure out, secure, we would need to have an experience of the origin of worlds. And we don't. Now, Cleanthes, Philo was going on in this vigorous manner, somewhere between joking and seriousness, when he noticed the impatience in Cleanthes and immediately stopped. What I wanted to cut in with, said Cleanthes, is only the suggestion that you stop abusing terms, using common everyday expressions to subvert philosophical reasoning. You know that common people often distinguish from often distinguish reason from experience, even where the question relates only to a matter of fact and experience. Though it is found that there is a kind of reason is properly analyzed, it turns out to be nothing more than a sort of experience. To prove by experience the universe was originated by a mind is no more contrary to common speech than to prove by experience that the earth moves. Yes, interrupted Philo. We do have other Earths. Isn't the moon another Earth, which we see to turn around its center? And isn't Venus another Earth, where we see the same thing? Aren't the revolutions of the sun also a confirmation, through analogy, of the same theory? Aren't all planets that revolve around the sun Earths? Aren't the satellites of Jupiter and Saturn's moons that move around the sun along with their primary planets? These analogies and resemblances, and others that I haven't mentioned, are the only evidence for the Copernican system. It is for you to consider whether you have any analogies of the same kind to support your theory. So, arguing from the similarities in the Copernican system to the claim that God made the universe, Philo says that's dissimilar. You can't make that jump. In reality, Cleanthes, Philo continues, the modern system of astronomy is now so thoroughly accepted by all inquirers and has become an essential part of the education even of small children that we were often not very scrupulous about examining the reasons for it. And I know I found that. I've asked my students, how do you know the sun's at the center? They don't know. Someone told them that, and they just always believed it. But I suspect you haven't actually studied either Galileo or Copernicus or Kepler on the structure of the solar system, and you don't have any arguments for it. And that's too bad then, isn't it? When something becomes so accepted as a piece of authority that you no longer have to work through the arguments yourself, it loses its status as knowledge. It's become a matter of mere scholarly curiosity to study those writers I just mentioned. You may not have even heard of them before. You might not know what Kepler did. So the older, outdated view, the Aristotelian scientists, relying on sensory illusions, had made a great deal of this distinction. They laid it down that celestial substances cannot be generated, altered, or in any way affected. But Galileo, beginning with the moon, proved its similarity in every detail to Earth, that it does change and is affected. So Aristotle was wrong about that. And after many examples of this kind relating to all the planets, men saw that these bodies were proper objects of experience. The cautious proceeding of the astronomers condemns your argument, Cleanthes. Can you claim to show any such similarity between the structure of a house and the generation of a universe? Have you ever seen nature in a situation that resembles the first arrangement of the elements at the beginning of the universe? Have worlds ever been formed under your eye, and have you had leisure to observe the whole progress of world making from the first appearance of order to its final consummation? Of course, the answer is no. If you have, then cite your experience and deliver your theory. So part 2 ends with Philo delivering this attack on any argument from experience. No one has experienced the origin of universes, and so no one can claim there's an analogy between them and a house in an argument that God exists. So at this point, it seems between Demea and Philo that the case has been made that human reason can't attain knowledge of the nature of God. And we'll see if things end there or if Cleanthes has any responses.